Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Contracts 101, Choosing and Completing AIA Owner-Architect Agreements webinar, brought to you by AIA Contract Documents. You will receive a recording with today's session, an email with the recording and the PowerPoint from today's session by tomorrow. This presentation is protected by U.S. and international copyright laws, and it is registered with the AIA for one learning unit. When you registered for today's course, you entered your AIA member number if applicable. We'll use that information to report your credit directly to the AIA within 1 business week. Now I'm going to turn it over to one of our presenters, Josh Flowers, to introduce himself. Josh?
Hi everyone, this is Josh Flowers. I'm legal counsel with Gresham Smith in Nashville, Tennessee.
Hi, I'm Marika Snyder. I'm a faculty member at Utah Valley University, where I teach primarily in historic preservation, architecture history, and building codes and construction law. I've also been practicing with my own firm since 2003 in Ohio and Utah.
So we're talking today about completing the owner-architect agreements, and we wanted to start by giving some background on the AIA documents themselves and the documents program at the AIA. This has been a program of AIA since 1888. So one of the advantages of that is that these documents have been widely known and interpreted over the years. So there's reliability in having documents that have been used so widely and interpreted by the courts. It started out with just a few documents, but as the industry has become more complex and the profession has grown, there are now nearly 200 different documents. So today we'll be focusing on the owner-architect agreement, and we'll refer to some other documents that may be helpful as resources as you complete those forms. Some of the goals of AIA contract documents are to provide resources for the industry at large. And that was really how this program started many years ago, was that if there's no one trying to provide industry standards, then it can be difficult for the parties to create the forms when they're ready to start a project. So AIA has been doing this for many years and trying to make sure that there's a balanced approach that takes into account the interest of all of the different participants across the industry and making sure that risk is balanced where it can be managed best. So it's not looking at the advantage of any particular party, but it's trying to determine who has the best experience with any particular risk, and are they the party that should be taking ownership of that particular part of the agreement. This diagram looks at the drafting process that we go through as the AIA Documents Committee to prepare these forms. So the first step, everything starts with seeking input from different stakeholders. And the committee is made up of about 35 volunteers. There are other staff members at the AIA headquarters in DC, attorneys and other experts. There are insurance and other participants on the committee and outside counsel, but we go beyond that group to seek comments from others outside the committee to make sure that we're getting perspectives on the unique focus of each document. And then from there, we look at decisions from courts and other projects that may impact the direction of these documents, or if it's a new form, looking at what needs to be in place in the industry to fill a void with a new resource. And then there's a process that goes from there to refine the documents and to circulate them. There's a painstaking process. It's very detail oriented, as you can imagine, trying to make sure that all of the different complexities of the project are addressed in these documents. And then they are published. So Marika and I are working on documents now that will be published in the future. The AIA still does publish paper documents, but primarily users are accessing them through the online platform. And we referred to some of the stakeholders. Here you can see a breakdown of others that may be part of the process, the documents committee itself, the liaisons, which may be outside counsel or other industry participants. AIA members may be a part of this process, providing resources, and then others across the industry who have expertise and experience in particular areas that are part of the focus of the documents program. So for today, we want to take a look at owner-architect agreements specifically, and we'll be focusing on the B101, which is the owner-architect agreement. There are many different owner-architect agreements that are available through AIA for different types of projects. So this one is one that we're looking at for general project use, and we'll be referring to some of the others that you may be aware of. So for the B101, this shows the breakdown of how the document is structured and organized and the different areas that you'll be reviewing if you're using this document for one of your projects. And what we want to do with our webinar today is look at if you are using this document, there's content that's already provided as the industry standard form. There's also content that you as the user would be providing. And we want to look at where would you be spending most of your time if you're entering information for your project into these forms, information about the project itself, some information that may be related to your practice, the location of the project, and other specific information that's required from you. We won't be getting into a lot of the technical information with how you use the AI software, but we will be sharing other resources. If that's something that would be helpful to you, we'll try to share some ways that you can take advantage of things that are available. So if you're looking at this document structure for the purpose of completion, where are the areas that you would be spending a lot of your time? And you can see these are the sections that we'll be focusing on as we go through the document today and looking at the different areas that are subject to user completion. And you can see some of the items are listed here, and we will start by going through and looking at the initial information in the B101.
All right, so the cover sheet is really the first place where we start, and that includes the contact information for the project. This is the information that all the parties will want to have readily available so that you can look up. It's the date, the owner, the architect, and the project. So first, the date. You can select any date in here, but it becomes the official date of the contract. And we'll talk a little bit more about why this matters later in Articles 4 and 11. So second, you fill in the owner's information, their name, their contact information, and their legal status, such as if they're an LLC or an S Corp or a partnership. And then next, the architect's information. For architects working in only one state, your legal status might be fairly simple. But if you work in multiple states, you may have different legal statuses state by state. So it's important to make sure that you put the correct legal status based on the state that the project is in. And then last is the project information. This is the official project name and address and what's being done. And at the bottom of the page, you can't see that here on this slide, but it says the owner and the architect agree as follows. And so everything after the cover page is where we memorialize all of the agreements which make up this contract. All right, so as we turn the page, we now officially start with Article 1. And these are the basic assumptions about the project. Article 1 is project specific, and it's probably going to take the bulk of your time each time that you fill this out in the future. So the initial information begins with the owner's program. It might be something really simple like 30,000 square foot storage building with no plumbing. You could just write that in there. But if it's more complicated, you can attach a full program document as an exhibit. The program is really important for defining basic services. If it's not in the program, then it would count as an additional service. So let's say that that warehouse that we just mentioned suddenly becomes a warehouse plus some offices with a coffee shop and a mezzanine, that would be additional services because it was an increase in program beyond what was in the contract. So in 1.1.2, the project's physical characteristics are listed here. It could be something as simple as the property legal description. However, if you want a more detailed explanation, you can attach a survey such as geotech reports or other reports. You just attach those as an exhibit. The owner's budget is also very important. You want to record that whenever possible, even if it's a rough estimate, because a $500,000 project is very different from a $50 million project. So you could list a simple number here, or it could be a breakout of several different parts of the project. And if it's more complicated, you can always attach an exhibit. When hitting certain milestones is important, you want to include them here in 1.1.4. Some projects must start by a certain date. Others must need to achieve substantial completion by a particular day. If there aren't hard deadlines, you can write in not applicable. And also if there's any other kind of milestone that needs to be hit, you would put that in this section. So in 1.1.5, we talk about procurement method. This is what used to be called the bidding and negotiating phase. So the type of procurement affects the architect's services, particularly in the procurement and construction phases. The typical choices are listed here in the parenthetical. If you're using the B101, it's probably not a design build project. It could be competitive bid, which means the architect has more services to administer in the construction and procurement phases. If it's a negotiated contract for construction, the architect will still be reviewing contractor proposals, and this is different from a competitive bid. And then if the project has an accelerated construction schedule, or even fast-track design and construction, or multiple bid packages or phased construction, you want to put that here because that affects the architect's scope of services and also the time frame that you have to work on it. When we talk about sustainable objectives, it's really important to clarify what those are at the beginning of the project. Does the owner want a LEED certified building? And if so, to what level? A sustainability objective could also be a well building standard or all Energy Star equipment or something even less formal. The E204 is a really good document to use in tandem with the B101. It helps you think through all of the specifics of sustainable projects. And so if it's applicable, fill out the E204 and attach it to the document. But if there's no sustainable objective, list not applicable so that it's clear that you aren't being held to that standard through the design project. All right, and then the owner's representative, as you know, it's important to identify the owner's representative. Who's the decision maker and what is the official way to get a hold of that person? And then we also want to list the owner's consultants and contractors. It's important to be clear which consultants and contractors the owner is retaining. Oftentimes that's geotech or civil engineers and sometimes others, but also include the contact person at these firms as well. And then we get to the architect's representative. In a small firm, it might be fairly obvious, but in larger firms, it can be very important to document the person in charge of the project, particularly if a firm works in multiple states or in multiple offices. Again, we're just trying to make everything as clear as possible in this initial information. Under 1.1.11, we list the architect's consultants. These are consultants that are hired and paid by you. If you work with the same engineer on a regular basis, you can just complete this section out fully. But if you don't know what firm you'll use, you could say to be determined later and write that in. Even if you don't know all of the consultants, it's important to memorialize which disciplines you're going to be retaining as a part of basic services. The more information you can include, the better. Again, these are the consultants that are hired and paid by you. If you have consultants that you will hire for supplemental services, you list them in the next section under 1.1.11.2, the supplemental services. And we'll talk a little bit more about supplemental services in section 4. And then the last section to fill out in section 1 is other initial information. If there's something unique that's not defined elsewhere in this document, you're going to put that here. For example, if this project is phase 1 of a master plan, you might list that here.
So before we move on, we've gone through some of the areas that will need to be completed, and we want to take a look at an example document so we can see how this would look if you were actually filling one out. So we've prepared a form just going through and filling in for an example project. And some of the things you may want to refer to if you're doing this yourself, AIA does provide resources on the website. There are instructions for a lot of the documents if you're preparing these. Some of them have commentary available that may provide more information if you have questions about some of the fields that you're entering. But we can scroll through and take a look at some of the things that Marika explained earlier. The date and the information for the parties is listed, and then some of the project-specific information, maybe some information that is entered into the form itself and some that refers to other documents that would be incorporated as exhibits to the agreement. So that's a choice that you'll want to make. Does it make more sense to try to enter this information as text in the agreement, or is it more a volume of information that makes more sense to format it and have it as a separate document and list it as an exhibit? So for the program, you can see this one is listed as information in the document itself, and then the physical characteristics refers to a document outside of the agreement form itself. And you can see the dates are listed, taken from the schedule, and this is something that may need to be circulated. There may be a schedule exhibit to the agreement as well. A lot of times you'll want to enter these specific dates into the agreement form, and then if there are more dates, you can make the decision to incorporate an exhibit or list other blanks here to describe more dates from the schedule. And as Marika said, there is the sustainability objective and the E204 document that you can select as an exhibit to describe the architect's services related to the owner's sustainable objective. And that's what's listed here as a reference to the E204 for more description of the sustainable objective. The parties are listed, the information for the consultants, and some of this would need to correspond potentially with other documents that are related to the project. If there are agreements between the architect and the consultant or the owner and the consultant, you may want to make sure that all of the same information is being circulated to all of the parties, especially as it relates to contact information for team members. So we'll go back and continue on with the other areas. Starting with Article 2, this gets into requirements that the architect may need to fulfill related to insurance specifically. And here you can see some of the issues that you may run across when you're completing insurance. And one of the starting points may be looking at other insurance requirements that have been made available prior to entering into contract negotiations. So if there is a request for proposal, a request for qualifications that the owner has created, those documents may include insurance requirements for the project. And if that's the case, you may be pulling information from those earlier documents to make sure that you're complying with insurance requirements that you've already committed to. And if that's the case, you'll want to make sure that you're entering those requirements the way they're stated, or if there are changes to those documents, that it's been agreed to so that you can move forward with signing this agreement. Part of the issue with entering your insurance information is making sure that you're referring to the different breakdown within each type of insurance. So in section 251, you can see the reference to the architect's commercial general liability policy. but there are two separate blanks referencing an amount for each occurrence and an amount in the aggregate. So there's just some detail that you want to make sure that you're entering the information in the correct blanks so that there's not a discrepancy with the actual insurance coverage that the architect is providing. There's a blank for the architect's auto coverage, which tends to be relatively straightforward. And you can see on the next section in 254, the workers' compensation insurance does not have a blank. The standard form refers to the statutory limits, but that is still something that you will want to cross-reference and make sure that if you're doing a project out of state and you'd have questions about whether your workers' comp complies with the state where the project is located, you'll need to refer to your insurance representative to confirm that you're in compliance with the standard forms referencing the statutory limits. For employer's liability, you can see there are 3 separate blanks for this section referencing different limits within the employer's liability policy. And professional liability tends to be the one that gets the most attention because it is the applies if there are claims for errors and omissions related to negligence by the architect. So this one may be something that is scrutinized a little bit more closely. Some of the other policies may tend to be the same from project to project. Professional liability may tend to vary, and you'll want to make sure that you're referring to any of those previous insurance requirements to be sure that you're entering this amount, because sometimes the insurance requirements may be different for what you're required to provide for the project versus what you typically carry as your practice policy for professional liability. So if those numbers are different, you want to make sure that you're complying with the project requirements for the numbers that you enter here, not necessarily the limits as they're stated on your policy for your entire practice. So it can be a little bit complicated. It may be something that you'll want to get your insurance representatives involved in reviewing to make sure that everything is correct. Another thing to be aware of, especially with the professional liability coverage, but really with all of the insurance information, is that if the owner is asking for insurance in excess of what the architect typically provides, there are other sections of the agreement, specifically when we get to Article 11, that will talk about how is the architect compensated if the owner wants the architect to procure additional insurance from the architect's policies or procures separate policies of insurance. How would that be addressed within this agreement? So be aware if you are comparing the requirements to the insurance that you provide and you see that the owner is asking for something above what the architect typically would provide, you'll want to cross-reference this section with some of the provisions later on in Article 11. In Article 4, we start looking at the different ways to define the architect's services. In Article 3, the architect's basic services are defined, and those are things that are included in the architect's basic compensation, the way it's defined in the agreement. The B101 includes 2 different definitions of services that are outside the architect's basic services. One of them is what's referred to as supplemental services. And these are things that are known at the outset of the project that are beyond what is defined in Article 3 as the architect's basic services. So these may be things that are unique to the project, but are known before the project begins. The other category is additional services, and these are things that are not known at the time the agreement is signed, but the parties know that there will be things that will change, circumstances that will arise over the course of the project that will require modifications to the architect's basic services. So the additional services are referring to those things that would change as they arise during the project. So it's important to keep the distinction between the supplemental services that are things that are defined initially and the additional services that change during the project. And also to be sure that you're referring back to the different compensation provisions for all of these categories of the architect's services in Article 11, which we'll look at in a few minutes. So for supplemental services, if you're familiar with the AI agreements, you probably have seen this matrix of supplemental services. And this gives you a menu to look at to see if there are things that the architect is providing that are not defined in Article 3. You can fill out this matrix to refer to things that the architect will provide. If some of these are provided by the owner, you can reference the owner, and then you complete the matrix by anything that is not provided. You designate that so that it's clear that it's not left blank unintentionally. And once you determine who's providing those services, it's good to define what those services are. So if you look at the matrix, for example, if the architect is providing existing facilities surveys and it's checked on the matrix that the architect will provide that, you would then provide a definition in section 4121 for those services. And AI documents provides several standard forms for the architect's services. A lot of these things are defined in separate documents that you can refer to as an exhibit. And when you're preparing your scope of services, you may want to refer to those documents as resources and make changes if you feel like they are different from what you're actually providing. And if you prefer, you can also define your services here in this section. And there's a section for things that the owner is providing to be defined here as well. For additional services, there are a few areas to be completed in the form. One of them has to do with changes that may occur during the construction phase, and there's an opportunity to limit what is provided in basic services by providing a number of times that each of these actions would occur within basic services, so that beyond that limit, those would be considered additional services under the agreement. And you can see this is referring to things that may occur during the construction phase that could require the architect to repeat the action multiple times. And a lot of these also refer to coordination that's required between the architect and the contractor, and things that may be outside of the architect's control and difficult to define at the outset. So this gives you the chance to define what's included in the architect's basic services so that if it goes beyond that, it will be compensated as additional services. Things like review of shop drawings, visits to the site, the inspection for substantial completion. If those have to be repeated multiple times, how would it be calculated in determining the architect's compensation? Another provision in Article 4 that needs to be completed for defining the architect's basic services is section 425, which refers to a duration for the architect's services. So you would define a duration by completing this blank with a number of months, and beyond that, there may be additional services required. And it's important with this section to understand that what's referred to here is the date of this agreement. So when Marika was looking at the cover page, the first blank that you fill out on this form is the date of the agreement. And you want to make sure that when you're doing that, you understand the significance, because it may be something that needs to be coordinated with the schedule, especially as it relates to this section in 425, to make sure that the duration as it's running from the beginning date as the date of this agreement, that you understand how that is implicating the architect's basic services.
All right, now we're going to move on to Articles 8 and 9, and these are for when things go wrong. They comprise dispute resolution and termination. These two sections are one of the reasons why I, as a small firm owner, switched from the B105, the short form, which I used to use, to the B101, because there's a lot more protections and it's much more clear about termination and dispute resolution. So in section 8.2.4, you select the form of dispute resolution. You'll notice that mediation is not listed here. That's because in section 8.2, it requires non-binding mediation if the owner and the architect can't agree. But if that fails, then the dispute goes to a form of binding dispute resolution, such as arbitration or litigation. And so to have the binding dispute resolution, it requires the parties to opt into that form. So you could use arbitration, litigation, or something else. If this section is not selected, then the default is that the dispute will be resolved in court.
And then for termination, you'll want to review the termination provisions and also be aware that in 9.7, there is the opportunity to define a termination fee. And this is broken into two different amounts. There's one which would be the termination fee that would be payable to the architect if the owner terminates for convenience or if the architect terminates under section 9.3. There's a separate section in item 2 to define a licensing fee for the owner's continued use of the architect's instruments of service. So this is something that could be broken out and defined in two different ways. And we'll take a look back at the example document and go back through some of these that we've discussed. This shows the insurance amounts that have been completed for an example project, looking at the different provisions. And then in Article 4, where we talked about supplemental services, this shows an example of how the matrix could be completed. And in this one, you can see that in item 41124, we have defined that the architect is providing sustainable services for the project, and the architect is also providing historic preservation services as the architect's supplemental services. So in this one, for the definition, we've referenced AI document B205, which is a form of the architect's services for historic preservation, and listed that this would be included as an exhibit in the agreement. So this would be the way of defining what is meant by the architect's supplemental services for historic preservation. There's another document reference to define the owner's supplemental services. For the additional services, you can see that this has been completed to provide that limit of what is included in basic services for the architect's actions during the construction phase. And then there's a duration that has been included running 24 months, like we said, from the date of this agreement as it's entered at the top of page 1 of the document. So we also talked about the claims and dispute resolution section and the opportunity to select the method of binding dispute resolution. In this document, litigation has been selected and marked, and then the blanks that are not used have been marked as not applicable so that it's clear that the parties have not left something blank unintentionally. And then, as we talked about for the termination provisions, for the termination fee, you can see that there's a calculation method that's been entered here for the termination fee, and there's a stipulated sum that has been entered for the licensing fee. So there are many different ways that this could be negotiated by the parties. The agreement form itself gives you the flexibility to define how that would best suit your project, but you can see there are examples of how that would be completed. So we'll return to the description for Article 11.
So Article 11, thanks Josh, we talk about compensation. Much of what Josh has just talked about is information that might take a lot of time the first time you fill out one of these B101s, but generally will be much easier with each subsequent usage. Obviously, the Article 1 was very project specific, and then Article 11 will be another one of the articles that'll be customized for each project. So Article 11 uses the assumptions of the most common methods of determining compensation, which are stipulated sum, percentage of construction cost, or other, which generally is hourly. If you're using other, you'll describe that in 11.1.3. And specific information about compensation based on a percentage basis is listed in 11.6. And then for hourly billing rates, that's listed in 11.7. So we'll just keep going through here chronologically. In 11.2, you describe how you get paid for these supplemental services. You can use a combination of methods depending on the service. So for example, I might charge hourly for historic archival research time as part of my historic preservation services, but I might charge just a stipulated sum for each historic paint analysis. And then if I were doing value analysis, I could charge a percentage based on what I saved the owner. All of these different types of compensation can be used in the same project. It's just important to spell out the amount or the basis of compensation for each different type. And if all of the supplemental services are hourly, then you just list that and refer to the table of hourly rates in 11.7. The compensation for additional services is similar to supplemental services in that you can mix and match compensation types. For example, you could charge hourly for additional submittal reviews or a flat fee for site visits. You would insert the amount or the basis for compensation here. For both supplemental and architect and additional services, the architect is entitled to a percentage fee on top of consultants' fees. So you would list that here in the chevron brackets, or if you'd like something else, write it in the line below. In 11.5, there's a chart of how you break down the architect's compensation for phase. This applies generally to stipulated sum or percentage basis projects. The last line is left blank in case you have some other phase or something else that's not covered here. And I'd like to highlight just one thing with compensation based on a percentage basis project. If a portion of the project is not built, but it was designed by the architect is still entitled to compensation for portions designed. So if you contracted to design a high school based on a percentage of the construction cost, and the bond issue fails and the school board decides to build the school but without the gymnasium, the owner is still required to pay the architect for the design services for the gymnasium, even though it wasn't built. All right, and now in 11.6, we talk about the hourly billing rates. Even if you do a stipulated sum, it's a good idea to include your hourly rates here. That way, they've been established and agreed on in case you need to use them for some other things, such as additional or supplemental services. So by including them there, you don't have to negotiate them later. So you can either just type them in here in the form, or if you prefer, you may attach an exhibit with the billing rates rather than just writing them in the document. 11.8 talks about reimbursables, and this is a list of all the reimbursable expenses. It's fairly specific, so if an item is not on the list, you don't get reimbursed for that. So if you want to be reimbursed for something else that's not on the list, make sure to edit the document to include that. And down at the bottom, you can see 11.8.2 lists the percentage that you would charge on top of the actual expense incurred. So don't forget to fill out that little point here. Josh talked about this previously, but if a project requires additional insurance beyond what you normally cover, the owner pays these additional costs. And so you would list those insurance amounts here in 11.9. So make sure that the two sections work hand in hand and you've got the same information so that one supports the other and there's no confusion. In 11.10.1.1, we fill out the initial payment. If there is no additional payment, put 0 or not applicable here. If you leave this blank, it could cause confusion later. If there's a sustainable certification as part of the sustainable objective, the architect may also charge an additional payment to cover costs to the certifying authority, and you list those here. If you don't have any, then type not applicable. And then monthly progress payments are the default for this document. If you want something different, you'll need to edit the document so that you can include that. The first fill point is the grace period. How long after the past due invoice before interest starts accruing? And then at the bottom, you can include a monthly or an annual interest rate.
So that takes us through a lot of the blanks that will be completed to finalize the form. At the end of the agreement, you'll see that there are some open-ended sections to allow you to complete other terms that may not be included in the standard form. In Article 12, if there are legal terms and provisions that you need to include related to the specific project, if there are unique risks that are presented by the project, you will have the opportunity to include those terms here. There may be other provisions recommended by the insurance companies that are providing insurance for the project. Those provisions can go here in Article 12. And this is an option that some people like, is to include all of the different terms that are separate from the standard language in the agreement form and include all of that in Article 12. The other option is to edit the different sections themselves and add different sections within the different articles with the information that's related to the changes that you're making. So it's a matter of preference and how you want to have that information presented, and it's something that the parties can discuss as they are completing the form. So you'll see a lot of different information included in Article 12, and we'll take a look at an example to see how that would look. And then in Article 13, there is an opportunity to define the scope of the agreement. So as we've been going through these different sections of the agreement, we've referenced different areas where there may be an exhibit that would be used to add additional information that's not specifically stated in the agreement itself. So you'll want to make sure that anytime you're listing an exhibit somewhere in the agreement, that you're also including it as a named exhibit listed in Article 13, so that the entire scope of the agreement is defined here in Article 13. And this also provides a reference that if you are looking at what are the agreements that comprise this document and what are the different exhibits that are listed here, this gives you a way to look at those and see what has been included. So we've gotten through the definition of all of these terms, and we want to see how it looks on the example for the remaining areas. So we talked about Article 11. You can see for this example, the parties have selected a stipulated sum for the architect's compensation, and it has been defined there. And then the percentage information has been deleted and marked as not applicable, and then there's no other information, so that has also been marked. There is an amount that has been included for sustainability services as a stipulated sum. And in 11.3, the method for calculating additional services compensation has been referenced as the architect's hourly rates. For 11.4, where it's referencing what's sometimes referred to as a markup on the additional services of the architect's consultants, the parties have entered an amount there, and then the other information has been marked as not applicable. And then the breakdown of each phase has been calculated. One of the things that you may want to be aware of here is that there may be other services, especially early in the project. If there's a preliminary design phase that begins before schematic design, you may want to make sure that you're adding another line item to this matrix and assigning a percentage to these other phases. You may see that the architect is not having compensation broken out for the procurement phase. There may be other changes that the parties will make to this, but it's important to make sure that this is completed as it relates to the architect's compensation. And then in 11.7, there is a reference to an exhibit for the architect's hourly rate schedule. You can also use the matrix and enter the hourly rates in the form itself, but you can see that the parties have opted to include an exhibit and have deleted the matrix from the form as part of the completion. There's an amount that's been entered to calculate the compensation for reimbursable expenses and an amount for the initial payment and the sustainable objective amount. Then there is an amount that's been entered for the term for progress payments, and this is something that does require some discussion because This is when you will determine if there is a late invoice or a late payment by the owner. It's calculated according to the amount that has been entered in this blank for the review of invoices. And then in Article 12 for this project, there's specific information that's been entered referencing the ADA and compliance as additional legal terms for the agreement. There could be other terms that would be entered here as we discussed, but that's the one that's been referenced for this example project. And then in Article 13, you can see how it would look to have the other exhibits listed, the items marked for the exhibits that are referenced in the form and included here, and then referenced in the document itself.
All right, finally, we get to complete the document with the signatures. So obviously the owner signs on the owner's side and prints his or her name and title. The architect also signs with title. And in some states, it may be necessary to include the architect's license number as well. So make sure that you do that in whatever states require that. You'll notice that there is no date on the signature page. That's to alleviate any confusion. The date of the contract is the date listed on the cover sheet, that first date that we listed, and that becomes the official date.
So as we've been going through, we've talked about a lot of things that may require some technical experience just with managing the AIA software and editing these forms, getting them into the final format. And we haven't had time to go through that during this session, but there are resources that may help you if you want to access them. So you can see what's listed here. There are available resources on the AIA website that you'll want to access. There are other learning resources that you can look at if it helps go through the particular forms that you're using. You can also reference the AIA contacts if you have specific questions that you need help with as you're going through the forms. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Hasti, and if you have any questions, we will answer them.
Thank you so much, Josh and Marika. A very thorough presentation on how to complete the B101. As Josh mentioned, we invite you to enter any questions in the chat or question feature on your right-hand side of GoToWebinar. We do have some time to answer questions, so please go ahead and enter those now. Before we get started with the Q&A session, I just want to remind all attendees that you will be emailed the PowerPoint along with the recording by tomorrow. We also place all recordings of our live webinars on our Learn page. So you can also visit the AIA Contract Documents Learn page at any time to view a large number of on-demand webinars as well. So with that, let's go ahead and start with the Q&A. We have a question here. Is there a standard percentage for each project phase, or is it always project specific?
I think that would depend on your firm and how you work. So some firms may have a standard, but it's probably most likely going to be project specific.
And I agree with that. I believe where you would see that information would be in Article 11, where we were looking at this percentage breakdown. So there is not a standard that would apply to every project, and it can vary depending on the market that you're working in. There may be specifics related to the schedule where the parties will negotiate different percentages for these different phases. And that's the flexibility with the agreement, is that you don't have to use the same percentages for every project. Some firms prefer to use the same percentages as a standard for all of their projects and want to make sure that this matrix looks the same on all of the agreements that the firm enters into. Others prefer to have it be project specific within their firms and have different standards that they use for different project types. So it's something that you may want to see what works the best for you and bring your experience into the negotiation so that you're making recommendations as to what you think lines up the best with your past projects, and share that information as you're going through it.
And one more thing on that, it also might change over time. I know a lot of firms are pushing more towards the beginning of the project because BIM requires so much more information. And so in the past, schematic design might have been a smaller percentage, whereas now it might need to be higher. So it's very flexible.
Okay, great. How would you enter prepayment for each phase of service?
So if you've had prepayment, that may refer to payment that has been made before the agreement has been executed. And if the architect has received payment, for example, under a letter agreement that was executed by the parties before they entered into this agreement, you'll want to reference all of the payments that have been made. A lot of times where you'll see that information is in section 11.1. So if the total compensation for the entire project is a stipulated sum, but there's been some amount that has been paid initially that's going to be credited to the stipulated sum as the total compensation, you could have more description within this item to talk about prepayment has been received and has been credited against the total compensation. So a lot of times it involves making sure that there's a total number for the entire project that includes initial payments that have been made prior to the agreement and all of the compensation made over the course of the agreement, which is all part of the architect's compensation for basic services. And then if there are additions for additional services, then it would fall under some of the other sections that we've looked at related to those types of services.
Okay, we've got a lot of questions coming in. Do you add consultant fees in Article 11, or do you only add the architectural fee?
So that's something that may be specific related to the negotiations of the parties. Typically what you see is that the architect's basic services includes any sub-consultants that the architect has retained. So you may not see the consultant's compensation broken out as separate line items in this agreement. If that's something that has been disclosed, it may be part of a more complex fee structure where you would prefer to reference a fee matrix as an exhibit to the agreement. If there are multiple separate line items that make up the architect's basic fee, that may be something where it's more helpful to see that information in tabular format in an exhibit. But that's something that you can determine how it works best for the project. But typically the architect's basic services compensation would include anything that the architect is providing as far as consultant services under the architect as the prime consultant to the owner.
Okay, what are the significant differences between B101 and B105?
I guess I should do that because, so if you pull up B105, there is actually not, it doesn't talk about how to terminate for convenience for the architect. And so in that way, and you could just go look those up. There's, I don't know, Josh, maybe you can answer this. That's a pretty big question because the B101 is about 2 to 3 times as long as the 105. Do you have a good summary?
It's something that if you're looking at what is the agreement that's going to be the best fit for your project, you may want to review several of the available documents that AIA has within the program. Specifically, the B105 is a short form agreement. So like Marika said, you will not see a document that's as long as what the B101 is. And you can see this example document is 24 pages. So the B105 is much shorter and does not include a lot of the terms that are in this agreement. So you may want to see, do you think that that's a better fit for your project and the complexity? One of the things that you may run across is just because a project is smaller in terms of the scope of the project, if the fee is not as much as compared to other projects, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a less complex project and that the delivery is going to be less complex. So it's not necessarily talking about the scope of the project or the cost of the project. It may be referring to the complexity and the delivery method. So you'll want to take those things into account. And I would recommend just reviewing some of these agreements and comparing what's included and seeing which one do you think is going to be the best fit for your project. We've talked about the B101 today. We've talked a little bit about referencing the B105 short form agreement. There are several other forms that you may want to consider and finding the one that you think will work the best for you.
And to support that, I think also the big issue is about the risk. So if it's a small, very clearly defined project, I've used the 105 on projects where they're repeat clients and they're fairly simple. But I have moved towards the B101 just because I've found that when things do go wrong, the B101 clarifies a lot of things, and the 105 has obviously less information in it.
If I need to amend a B101 to increase or reduce scope, do I complete this again, or is there an amendment form?
There is an amendment form that you can use. AIA provides a standard form of amendment for AIA documents. You can access that and provide it as an amendment. You would not want to execute this agreement again. This agreement is intended to be in place throughout the project. And if there are changes that are made, you would want to use an amendment form. Some of the parties prefer to prepare the amendment form based on the owner's requirements. If the owner has different ways that they approve, for example, increases in compensation, the owner may have its own form that would be used to amend the compensation provisions. Or if there is scope that has been added, there may be different forms that the parties would want to use to help define that. So you can start with the AIA amendment form as a cover page and then start attaching additional documents to define the changes. That would be if it's talking about changes in the scope and fee. If you get into changes to the legal terms to the agreement and you find yourself needing to amend the legal terms during the course of the project, you will want to make sure that you're going back to refer to this document. You're not executing it again, but you're executing an amendment that would provide the revised terms that would need to be executed in writing by the parties for those types of changes to be effective.
Is the lead a supplemental service or an additional service?
Well, that would be a supplemental service because it's something that you're going to agree on at the beginning. You said lead, correct?
Yes.
And additional services are things that arise over the course of the project. So you should be able to foresee if you wanted to do a lead project.
Right. And if you look through the agreement, you'll see sustainability falls within basic services. There are items within Article 3 that talk about sustainable services that would be part of the architect's basic services. But if you're talking about lead certification specifically, then it probably would fall under supplemental services. And there may be additional services. If lead has been contemplated at the outset, it would be different versus if lead comes up during the course of the project and needs to be changed based on what has been included.
I do see a few questions regarding technical questions. Can I use a digital signature? Should I delete the chevrons? We're getting close to the end of the webinar, but I do want to plug our basics training. If you look on our Learn page at aiacontracts.org/learn, there's a free webinar you can register for called Basics to the Online Service. It's done on a weekly schedule. You can register for that, and the trainer will answer all of the questions. You can use a digital signature. You should not delete chevrons. They will be deleted in your final automatically. But if you manually delete them, you can cause formatting issues. So questions like this and more can be answered in that training. Again, it's a free webinar that occurs every week. It's called The Basics. Okay, I think we might have time for one more question before we go ahead and end today's webinar. I work for a consulting firm, and we write in the AIA contracts, should we replace the word architect with consultant?
And if you're using this agreement, then it's the agreement between the architect and the owner. So you're usually seeing the term architect is used to refer to the primary architect who's signing this agreement. If you have additional architects that have been retained as sub-consultants to the architect, those would be referred to as consultants if they're listed where you see the consultants defined in Article 1. And then consultant is a defined term to list those consultants retained by the architect.
Great, and with that, I just want to remind everyone, when you registered, you entered your AIA member number, so we will use that information to report your credit within 1 business week, and it'll appear on your online transcript. Any questions that were entered today that we couldn't get to, please direct them to docinfo@aia.org. Docinfo is our service for any content-related questions about any of our contract documents or provisions. So if you do have a pressing question that we didn't have time to answer today, please direct that to docinfo@aia.org. With that, I want to thank Josh and Marika for their excellent and thorough presentation on the B101, and I want to thank all of you for taking the time to attend. Again, you will receive the recording and PowerPoint by tomorrow. With that, I wish you a happy afternoon. Thank you.